Okay, what about Lords of the Renaissance? Alright, well, to start with, the components are almost unusable. The map has such tiny spaces. This thing needs to be blown up 2 to 4 times its size to be usable. And the rest of it is really, these tiny little counters, the hand-cut cards, simple little sheets of paper. It's a photocopied rulebook stapled together. It's really, not something that you'd expect to be sold. But on the other hand, what year was this? Sierra Madre has come a long way in terms of components. Now they're actually producing games that, people would play. Now, the second edition of Lords of the Sierra Madre was very well done, but that was done in conjunction with Decision Games, which could do real rules. In the case of this one, well, if you're familiar with Phil Eklund games, you know that his rules are always a bitch and a half. In this particular game, I think that they're incomplete and missing some aspects. Still, I think I still find this one his most enjoyable design yet. From way back. It does everything that Lords of Sierra Madre kind of promised to do. Unfortunately, Lords of Sierra Madre ends up this kind of static game, whereas this one just has this wonderfully fluid interactions where there's the ability to move things around, move around the basic topography of the trade nets, etc., that you can't do in Lords of Sierra Madre. In Lords of Sierra Madre, particular players, particular cards give you such a geographical advantage that no one can compete. Which means that all the power in that location, in that territory, ends up centered in one person's hands. At least within Mexico. When you get north of the border, the U.S. has a little less capability. The troops, the police, probably can't, just take what they want from you. You have that same kind of power throughout this game. There's no limitation on it here. But the difference is that there's a great deal of flexibility as to who has power where. Movement is done in a scale that corresponds to the pace of the play. So a given year has 4 movement phases, but they're interspaced between bidding and trading and all this other stuff. So there's a lot of time for the situation to kind of develop, and you have time to try to come up with cards out of your ass that'll save you, or to come up with a deal. In Sierra Madre, instead, basically you have as much time as you want in any given turn to wreck someone who can be wrecked. So if you get the power advantage on someone, if you don't have a situation where you can make a deal, you can basically destroy their holding. And it just ends up that it's not profitable to do business in an area where someone else controls the military, or the police, or whatever it is. Usually it's going to be military and federales. This one, however, there's usually leverage. There's the ability to say, okay, look, if you're going to play hardball with me, I can make it really bad on you. That's something you can't really do in Sierra Madre unless you're both interlocked into positions in each other's territory. In this game, on the other hand, while I'm off smashing your stuff, you can slip in and do something to mine. It's very unlikely that can be in a position where you can defend your own territory and conduct significant attacks on other people's. The particular game that I played of it went way off the rails. Maybe because of not paying enough attention to how to defend the Ottoman Empire. Maybe because maybe I never pay that kind of attention, but normally I don't pay enough attention to realize that I could take someone out that quickly. Take one of the major empires out. And that, can totally derange the game or derail the game. Unlike with Sierra Madre as well, in a lot of cases there can be important and powerful cards that come up that actually change the whole flow of the game much more easily. So in Sierra Madre, usually the initial bid cards determine who gets what. In this, actually, it's even more static, or it's even more predetermined at the start, because certain players just have the right to claim the first empire, as it were. And you really want to get both parts of your empire for the most part, although when we look at France or England, maybe they're too far out on the edges, and you're better off taking half of one of the more powerful empires in a 6-player game. If the game goes above 6 players, everybody's kind of splitting up empires. I would probably say I wouldn't want to play it in more than 10, because if you don't have a piece of an empire, you're kind of at the mercy of people who do. And if all you have is a piece of one of the outliers, that's going to be pretty questionable. I think any number less than that, though, works pretty well. Officially, the game's supposed to only hold 12, but, actually, by the rules, you could play it with, 23 or something. No, 16, I think it'll hold. I think 16 is probably the maximum. But you're pushing it if you go above 10, I think. And if you try to get even 6 players around this board, this is the thing. I've had a lot of fun with this solitaire, especially in the early part of the game when the trade routes are first developing, when the game is first taking shape. And I had fun this time. It does drag a little bit. So does Lords. This one's always more fluid, though, so there's always kind of this opportunity to feel like you can get back in it. If you don't have cash, you're not going to be able to bid a god card that will turn things around as the Portuguese were able to do in my game. But you might be able to be the swing in the balance. You might be, as long as you have an empire, you might be able to do something that keeps you kind of in it. And everybody starts with a somewhat powerful position if they choose. In Lords of Sierra Madre, it's quite possible with 6 players. Really, there's kind of 4 important pieces of property you want to buy, military property, as it were, at the beginning of the game. In this, everybody gets something that's at least feels kind of like a fair shake. They have a shot at it. And if they don't like what's left, they can always pick off something, choose an empire that another player's already chosen and get the piece that they don't want of it, either the king or the chancellor. Overall, I just think that this is, this really wonderful implementation in the initial stages of the Lord's design, but it totally needs to be reworked. And unfortunately, I mentioned this on my comments in BGG. I think all Phil's planning on doing with it is a Pax Porfiriana type game. That doesn't work for me. I found Pax Porfiriana felt like a really complicated game of Illuminati, or even Cosmic Encounter, where you got to pay so much attention to what everybody's got and what's on the table There's no easy. So a board makes, and I mentioned this in the playthrough. A board makes the game so much easier to understand the threats present, the graphical representation and locality of where everything is and where those trade routes are or whatever. I can't imagine this as a card game being any better than Pax Porfiriana, and I know it's very popular right now, is in comparison to, say, Lords of Sierra Madre. Lords of Sierra Madre has its flaws, but I find that graphical representation makes the game more interesting on two sides. One, the most important for me is when I'm playing it solo, I can see the storyline arising. I don't see that storyline when all I have is a handful of cards and some cards on the table, and I'm busy trying to work out my bidding of those. The other, though, is that it's just easier to absorb. I found myself with the card game walking over across the table, a table this size, walking around the table so I could see what another player even had, spending my whole game basically worried about what other people have on the table rather than being able to just kind of absorb that information rapidly in terms of a map. Now, this map is harder to absorb. It would be much better if it was a much, much larger map, but it's still possible, barely, to cope with the components on this one. But, unfortunately, not only are the rules Eklund bad normally, they're also inconsistent, ambiguous, all kinds of those kind of problems. To the extent where between the components and the ambiguities in this, and I would say Lords of Sierra Madre was very easy to work out the ambiguities that were present. This one, I'm left with a lot more, and I'm just not sure about this. Between the components and the problems with the rules, I have never brought this to a group to play. I love the game. I wish to hell that I could, because it has such a dynamic feel to how those trade routes fall out, to how the power ends up balanced, that it would be a great deal of fun to play with the kind of group that I used to be in a way that Sierra Madre wasn't. Sierra Madre, we had fun with it, but it ends up very clear very quickly who owns what, and then it becomes, all right, well, if a card comes up in my area, it's a bonus for me. There was really no way you could get around that. You can't deprive somebody even of a bonus for them. You can't force the bidding up. There really is no competition over the cards in that game. In this game, there really can be. You could bid on something, or less than competition over the cards, somebody bids on something that's at the edge of their territory, and now you have a reason to kind of invade them and fuck with their lives, you know? And I really like that aspect to this. It is just so much more dynamic in play. But yeah, I tried a couple of times to convince people into it, but I never was really enthusiastic about it because I knew what I'd be facing. Essentially, you'd have to have somebody making up the rules and game mastering it, or else go through what we used to do with Empires in Arms and some other games, settling all the questions ahead of time. There's a lot of questions here. Europa Universalis too. It's pretty hard to agree, hey, let's spend, 4 or 5 hours discussing the rules and figuring out how we want to play for a game that is of this nature. To me, this is an afternoon, this is a one-day game. Empires in Arms, Europa Universalis, these things are, multi-months of sessions type games. Ugh. It makes sense to me that you'd play something like that in order to, that you'd want to hammer it all out before you actually got around to playing. With this, though, you're talking about, 50% of the time commitment would be spent trying to figure out just what the rules mean and arguing them out. So if you just had somebody game mastering it, and honestly, if you play this with Phil or some, I guess his son runs some of this, has run this as well. Who has that kind of authority? Yeah, I know what this is meant to be. Yeah, this is meant to be this. This is how you do it. That's great. But I think you need someone in that kind of authority. You need a game master. He can be playing, as long as he's fair about it. But unless you entrust the rules into someone's hands like that. So this would never become a game that I think people would feel comfortable, on a third or fourth or fifth playing to say, I understand it fully enough that as a group we can get together and play this and there won't be any problems. There will be. The more people start to learn the rules and such not, the more different interpretations that are going to come out of it. So it really needs a complete rules rewrite, hopefully by someone who... These aren't too terrible in terms of style. It gets a lot worse in later games, to tell you the truth. It's just the amount that's left out of them. And then there's another issue, which came up from some of the viewers looking at it, is that the few viewers looking at it, is that some really weird shit can happen in this game. There's no question. I mean, it's possible that the Sultan could become the Pope, Maybe I'm mistaken about that, but I don't see any restriction against it. Where you almost feel like, geez, I wish there was a game master to step in and correct those. I compare that. That's a matter of the scope of this game. The only other game that tried to do this kind of scope on such a light level that I can think of, well, Blood Royale too, but that's at an even lighter level. But I'm thinking Popes and Princes, something I'd love to get a copy of. Even just a photocopy of. It's an unplayable game, Popes and Princes. It's incomplete. And you can kind of see attempts to try to probably run a game based on it led to these kind of situations where it became, wow, we can't outlaw this. If we outlaw every special case, if we make all these special rules for the whole game, it ends up something the size of Europa Universalis instead of something this size, which is what P&P was trying to do. Unfortunately, with that game, I think the decision was, wow, if we can't do it right, let's sell it anyway, and maybe somebody else will figure out there's a game here. This one, there was a serious attempt to make a workable game, and I think other than the ambiguities and issues like that, there is a workable game here. With a little bit of development work and keeping a nod and a wink towards, yeah, you're going to get ridiculous situations like the papacy taking over the entire Mediterranean. But as long as you're willing to live with that, laughable factor, well, you've got what I think is the core of a really, really cool game. I have yet to try Lords of the Spanish Main. I've got a copy of that. I'm looking forward to it. But I really like the basic principle of the Lords system. And I think this one exemplifies how it could play out the most fun better than Sierra Madre does. It's just, in the final sort of polishing it up stage, it didn't work out as well. And then, of course, when it goes to printing and they come up with components that are I'm ashamed to try to make players play with this, with something that is this complex. Not complex in terms of the rule, but complex in terms of the board state. So many pennies on the board and little counters that are the size of my fingernail. That's fine when I'm playing a micro game with like 20 pieces, but this has quite a few components, and it really is one of the few games that I kind of feel like, geez, I really should pimp this one out in the sense of blowing up the map and maybe making some decent components out of it. You could really do a hell of a nice job with this one, and it almost deserve it would deserve it if it had a good rule set. So if someone wanted to really, really make this over, rewrite the rules, and make a really, really nice component set for it, it would be a fantastic game in my opinion. But that's not going to happen as far as I know.